In the winter of 1911, an unremarkable warehouse on the outskirts of Cleveland became the unlikely center of a controversy that would echo through the next century of medical history. Inside were shelves of handwritten ledgers, glass vials sealed with wax, and correspondence between physicians who were quietly experimenting with treatments derived not from laboratories, but from forests, fields, and kitchens. These doctors did not advertise their work. They shared it privately, aware that the medical establishment of the era was rapidly consolidating around patented compounds and standardized pharmaceuticals. What they recorded, however, was unsettling. Patients with chronic inflammatory conditions reported recoveries that conventional treatments had failed to produce. Degenerative ailments appeared to stabilize. In some cases, symptoms vanished entirely. The common factor was not a single cure, but a pattern of remedies that could not be owned. At the time, medicine was undergoing a profound transformation. The rise of industrial chemistry promised consistency and scale, but it also demanded exclusivity. Treatments that could not be synthesized, trademarked, or controlled posed a quiet threat to a system increasingly built on profit as much as progress. Archival letters from the period reveal mounting pressure on independent practitioners. Journals declined to publish their findings. Licensing boards questioned their credentials. By 1915, many of these physicians had abandoned their research, not because it failed, but because it attracted the wrong kind of attention. One of the most cited cases involves a compound derived from willow bark, long known in folk medicine for its analgesic properties, while its active component would later inspire a pharmaceutical analog. The original preparation remained effective without modification. According to hospital logs from rural Pennsylvania, patients treated with the unaltered extract experienced fewer complications and required lower dosages. Yet internal memos from a major drug manufacturer, uncovered decades later, describe the substance as commercially non-viable and recommend discouraging its use in favor of a refined, patentable alternative. The transition was swift. Medical schools updated curricula, pharmacies phased out the crude extract. Within a generation, the original remedy was dismissed as obsolete. This pattern repeated itself across continents. In Eastern Europe, fermented plant tonics used for metabolic disorders were quietly removed from public clinics after multinational firms entered the region. In parts of Asia, mushroom-based therapies with centuries of documented use were reclassified as supplements, stripping them of clinical legitimacy. Each decision was justified as modernization. Each resulted in the same outcome, a narrowing of acceptable medicine to what could be manufactured, branded, and sold at scale. Critics argue that this was not a conspiracy, but an inevitability of industrial progress. Yet the documents suggest otherwise. Minutes from closed-door meetings, preserved in private archives, reveal deliberate strategies to marginalize treatments that threatened market dominance. Language such as contain, neutralize, and redirect demand appears repeatedly. These were not scientific critiques, but commercial calculations. The remedies themselves were rarely disproven. They were simply ignored until they disappeared. By the mid-20th century, the narrative was complete. Natural treatments were reframed as quaint, unreliable, or dangerous. The public, conditioned to equate progress with innovation, accepted the shift without protest. What remained were fragments, anecdotal recoveries, fading traditions, and scattered evidence buried in overlooked journals. Only recently have historians begun to piece together the broader picture, recognizing that what was lost was not a miracle cure, but a diverse medical ecosystem that once operated alongside modern science. The question that lingers is not whether these remedies worked for everyone. No treatment ever does. The question is why so many were erased without transparent evaluation. As access to historical records expands, a more complex story emerges, one in which the boundaries of medicine were shaped not only by efficacy, but by economics. And in that story, the suppression of natural remedies becomes less a footnote and more a defining chapter in how modern healthcare came to be. By the 1920s, the medical marketplace had begun to resemble an industrial battlefield, and the most decisive weapon was not efficacy, but ownership. A treatment that could be patented gained legal protection, investor confidence, and institutional backing. A treatment that could not was left exposed. This distinction quietly determined which therapies survived and which vanished, often regardless of clinical outcomes. In internal correspondence between pharmaceutical executives and legal advisors from the period, the logic is laid bare. A cure that grows in soil or ferments in a jar cannot be monopolized. Without monopoly, there is no long-term revenue stream. Without revenue, there is no incentive to promote, defend, or even acknowledge its existence. One revealing case emerged from Germany in the interwar years, where a botanical preparation used to manage cardiovascular weakness had been refined by local physicians into a standardized protocol. Hospital records indicate reduced mortality rates among elderly patients. Yet the treatment's formula relied on a combination of readily available plants. When a synthetic alternative was introduced, its performance was comparable at best. Still, the synthetic version was aggressively marketed, while the botanical protocol was quietly removed from official guidelines. Letters exchanged between regulators and manufacturers suggest the decision was framed as a matter of quality control, though no evidence of harm from the original method was presented. Control, in this context, meant control of supply. The patent trap extended beyond Europe. In the United States, the aftermath of the Flexner Report reshaped medical education, emphasizing laboratory science and marginalizing empirical traditions. While the reforms improved standards in many respects, they also created a gatekeeping mechanism. Treatments unsupported by industrial research funding struggled to gain legitimacy. Practitioners who continued to use non-patentable remedies found themselves excluded from professional circles. Their work was labeled anecdotal, a term that carried a subtle but devastating implication unworthy of serious consideration. What makes this period especially troubling is the selective nature of skepticism. Synthetic drugs introduced during the same era often entered the market with limited long-term testing. Side effects were discovered only after widespread use. Yet these risks were tolerated as part of progress. Natural remedies, by contrast, were expected to meet an impossible standard of proof without access to the same resources. The imbalance was structural, not scientific. It ensured that only treatments aligned with commercial frameworks would advance. Archival data from early pharmaceutical trials further complicates the narrative. In several instances, plant-based compounds served as the starting point for synthetic derivatives. Once isolated and modified, the new molecule could be patented, even if its therapeutic action mirrored the original substance. The natural source was then dismissed as inferior. Despite being the foundation of the discovery, this process did not merely replace old remedies. It rewrote history, positioning industry as the sole origin of medical innovation. Patients were largely unaware of these dynamics. Advertising emphasized modernity, precision, and authority. Bottles with Latin names and clinical packaging inspired confidence, while traditional preparations were recast as relics of an unscientific past. Over time, collective memory shifted. What had once been common knowledge became obscure folklore. Generations grew up believing that effective medicine had always come from factories, not fields. The patent trap did more than eliminate specific remedies. It narrowed the imagination of what medicine could be by tying legitimacy to ownership. The system discouraged exploration of treatments that benefited the public but not shareholders. As a result, countless therapies were never fully studied, not because they lacked promise, but because they lacked profit potential. Understanding this mechanism is essential to grasping how suppression occurred, not through bans or raids, but through silence and omission, leaving behind a sanitized history that favored what could be sold over what could be shared. As pharmaceutical science expanded through the middle of the 20th century, its public face was one of transparency and progress. Peer-reviewed journals multiplied, regulatory agencies formalized testing standards, and research institutions promised accountability. Yet behind this orderly facade existed a parallel world of experimentation that left remarkably little trace. In basements beneath teaching hospitals, in private laboratories financed by industrial partners, and in provisional research centers that no longer exist, studies were conducted whose results never reached the public record. What unites these missing files is not what they contain, but what they threaten. Investigative historians examining defunct laboratory archives have noted a recurring pattern. Projects exploring non-synthetic therapies often ended abruptly, with funding withdrawn and documentation sealed or destroyed. In one case from 1947, a research team studying a fermentation-based treatment for autoimmune disorders reported preliminary outcomes that exceeded expectations. Patient inflammation markers dropped rapidly, and relapse rates were lower than those observed with existing drugs. Within months, the project was terminated. Official explanations cited methodological inconsistencies. Yet the lab's own notes, preserved by a junior technician, reveal standardized protocols and repeatable results. The inconsistency lay not in the data, but in its implications. The disappearance of evidence was rarely dramatic. There were no midnight raids or public scandals. Instead, files were misplaced, reports labeled inconclusive, and samples discarded once a project lost sponsorship. When laboratories closed or merged, entire collections of data vanished in the transition. In the pre-digital era, a study that was never published effectively ceased to exist. Without publication, there could be no debate, no replication, no challenge to the prevailing narrative. Silence became a form of control. Former researchers have occasionally broken that silence. In interviews conducted decades later, some described explicit instructions to deprioritize findings that could not be developed commercially. Others recalled being advised to redirect promising results toward synthetic analogs, even when modification reduced efficacy. These accounts, while difficult to verify in isolation, gain credibility through their consistency across countries and institutions. The same language appears again and again: focus, alignment, viability. None of it refers to patient outcomes. The loss of laboratory records also shaped regulatory history. Agencies tasked with evaluating treatments relied on available evidence. When unfavorable data was missing, decisions appeared objective. Natural remedies were rejected for lack of proof, while pharmaceutical products advanced, supported by selective documentation. This asymmetry reinforced the perception that one category was scientific and the other speculative, even though the underlying research landscape had been artificially curated. In some instances, fragments survive. Marginal notes in personal notebooks, correspondence between researchers, or unpublished theses hint at entire lines of inquiry abruptly abandoned. One recovered dissertation from the early 1960s details a mineral-rich water therapy that appeared to slow the progression of neurological decline. The work was never defended. The student advised to pursue a different topic. The spring from which the water was drawn was later purchased by a beverage company and rebranded, its medical history erased. What makes these vanished laboratories so unsettling is not merely the possibility that effective treatments were lost, but the realization that scientific memory can be engineered. By determining what is recorded and what is forgotten, institutions shape reality itself. The absence of evidence is often interpreted as evidence of absence, a logical shortcut that obscures the processes that created the gap. In the case of suppressed natural remedies, the empty shelves of archives speak as loudly as any surviving document, telling a story of knowledge that existed briefly, proved inconvenient, and was allowed to dissolve into obscurity. Regulation is often portrayed as a neutral safeguard, designed to protect the public from harm. In theory, it establishes standards, enforces transparency, and ensures that treatments meet rigorous criteria before reaching patients. In practice, during the latter half of the 20th century, regulation evolved into something more selective. The same rules that promised safety also became instruments that quietly eliminated entire categories of medicine. Natural remedies, particularly those without industrial backing, found themselves trapped in a regulatory maze they were never designed to navigate. The shift began as governments responded to real medical disasters. Poorly tested drugs had caused widespread harm, and public demand for oversight was justified. New agencies were granted sweeping authority to approve, restrict, or ban treatments. Yet the criteria they adopted reflected the structure of pharmaceutical research rather than the diversity of therapeutic traditions. Randomized, large-scale trials became the gold standard. These studies required enormous financial investment, specialized infrastructure, and long timelines. For major drug manufacturers, this was an obstacle but not an impossibility. For independent practitioners and small research groups studying non-patentable remedies, it was an insurmountable barrier. Documents from regulatory hearings in the 1970s reveal how this imbalance was understood and accepted at the highest levels in one transcript. An official acknowledges that traditional therapies would struggle to comply with new requirements, but dismisses the concern as an unavoidable consequence of progress. The assumption was that any treatment worth preserving would attract sufficient investment. The possibility that effective remedies might lack investors precisely because they could not be monopolized was never addressed. As regulations tightened, natural treatments were reclassified. What had once been recognized therapies became supplements, a category that carried no obligation for authorities to evaluate efficacy. This shift effectively removed them from the realm of medicine without formally banning them. Doctors were discouraged from recommending them. Insurers refused coverage, and research funding evaporated. The remedies themselves did not disappear, but their legitimacy did. They existed in a gray zone, tolerated but unrecognized. Their potential benefits rendered invisible to the official system. In some cases, regulation went further. Herbal preparations with long histories of use were subjected to standards that ignored their traditional context. Requirements for precise molecular characterization made sense for synthetic drugs, but were ill-suited to complex natural mixtures. When these standards could not be met, the conclusion was framed as scientific failure rather than methodological mismatch. Internal policy memos suggest that regulators were aware of this discrepancy, yet proceeded regardless, citing consistency as the ultimate priority. The consequences were felt globally. Developing nations, under pressure to align with international standards, abandoned local medical practices in favor of imported pharmaceuticals. Clinics that once relied on regionally sourced remedies closed or transformed into distribution points for branded drugs. Patients became consumers in a global market, dependent on supply chains, vulnerable to disruption and price manipulation. The diversity of medical approaches narrowed, not through debate, but through compliance. What makes the regulatory weapon so effective is its appearance of objectivity. Decisions were justified in the language of safety and science, masking the economic realities beneath. By defining legitimacy in terms that only certain players could satisfy, regulation reshaped medicine without ever declaring its intentions. The suppression of natural remedies thus occurred not in defiance of the law, but through it, a process that left no villains, only a system that quietly decided what knowledge was allowed to survive. By the late 20th century, the suppression of natural remedies had progressed beyond individual treatments and research programs. Entire medical traditions began to fade from public consciousness, not through prohibition, but through systematic neglect. Knowledge that had once been transmitted through apprenticeship, community practice, and regional institutions found no place within the modern healthcare framework. As hospitals standardized protocols and universities aligned curricula with regulatory and commercial priorities, these traditions were gradually severed from the mechanisms that sustained them. In Southern Europe, rural clinics that had integrated herbal and dietary therapies into conventional care were absorbed into national health systems. Officially, this represented modernization. Unofficially, it meant that generations of locally adapted medical knowledge were deemed unscientific and excluded from training. Elder practitioners retired without successors. Their methods, rarely documented in peer-reviewed journals, disappeared with them. When historians later attempted to reconstruct these practices, they encountered only fragments, handwritten recipes, oral accounts, and patient testimonies, dismissed as unreliable. A similar process unfolded in parts of Latin America and Asia, where colonial legacies intersected with post-war pharmaceutical expansion. Traditional healers were encouraged to abandon their roles or rebrand themselves as wellness advisors. Stripped of clinical authority, government health campaigns promoted standardized drugs as symbols of progress. While indigenous therapies were portrayed as obstacles to development, this narrative proved powerful. Younger generations, educated in Western biomedical models, internalized the message that legitimacy came from outside their own cultures. The loss of these traditions had practical consequences. Many natural remedies were not isolated substances, but components of broader systems that considered diet, environment, and lifestyle. When removed from this context, their effects could not be easily replicated or studied using reductionist methods. Researchers encountering isolated references to such treatments often concluded they were inconsistent or unproven, unaware that the missing variable was the system itself. In this way, suppression operated through fragmentation, breaking coherent practices into pieces that no longer made sense. There were attempts to preserve what was being lost. Ethnobotanists and medical anthropologists raced to record endangered knowledge, often working against the clock. Their field notes describe villages where remedies were still used effectively, even as official medicine ignored them. Yet these efforts rarely translated into policy or practice. Without institutional support, documentation remained academic. Disconnected from healthcare delivery, preservation without application became another form of marginalization. The disappearance of medical traditions also altered patient experience. Treatments that had emphasized continuity and personalization were replaced by standardized protocols. For some, this brought clear benefits. For others, particularly those with chronic or poorly understood conditions, it meant fewer options and a sense of alienation from their own care. The idea that medicine could be adapted to local realities gave way to a one-size-fits-all model, optimized for distribution rather than context. What remains today is a paradox. Modern medicine prides itself on evidence-based practice. Yet vast bodies of experiential evidence were allowed to vanish because they did not conform to prevailing economic and regulatory structures. The disappearance of these traditions was not an accident of history, but the cumulative result of choices about what counted as knowledge. In tracing their absence, we begin to see suppression not as a single act, but as a long erosion, one that reshaped healthcare by deciding, quietly and irrevocably, which voices would be remembered and which would be forgotten. Every system that narrows acceptable knowledge produces dissent, and modern medicine was no exception. Throughout the 20th century, a small but persistent group of scientists attempted to bridge the widening gap between natural remedies and institutional science. They did not reject laboratory methods or regulatory standards. Instead, they applied them to treatments that the system had already decided were unworthy of attention. What followed was rarely a scientific rebuttal. It was professional isolation. In archived correspondence from the 1950s, one biochemist described submitting a paper on a plant-derived anti-inflammatory compound that demonstrated measurable biochemical effects comparable to existing drugs. The journal's response was polite but firm. The topic was deemed outside the publication's scope. When the same data was reframed around a modified synthetic version of the compound, it was accepted within weeks. The message was unambiguous. The science was not the issue. The framing was. Others encountered more direct resistance. Researchers who persisted in studying non-patentable therapies found grant applications repeatedly rejected without detailed explanation. Invitations to conferences dried up. Teaching positions were quietly reassigned. In internal university memos, later obtained through Freedom of Information requests, administrators expressed concern that association with such work could jeopardize partnerships with industry sponsors. Academic freedom existed in principle, but not in practice. When funding determined survival, some scientists paid a heavier price. A physiologist in Scandinavia who published data suggesting that a traditional dietary intervention reduced cardiovascular risk was publicly criticized for romanticizing folklore. His findings were not disproven. They were ridiculed. Colleagues distanced themselves. Students were advised to seek other mentors. Within a few years, he left academia altogether. His subsequent work, conducted privately, never reached a wide audience. Not because it lacked merit, but because he lacked a platform. These stories are often dismissed as anecdotal, yet patterns emerge when viewed collectively. Those who challenged pharmaceutical dominance using its own tools faced reputational consequences that served as warnings to others. Younger researchers learned quickly which topics were safe and which were career-ending. Curiosity became conditional. Innovation flowed toward areas aligned with existing power structures, leaving alternative paths unexplored. What makes this suppression particularly effective is its subtlety. There were no formal bans on studying natural remedies. No laws forbade their investigation. Instead, incentives and penalties shaped behavior. Success was rewarded when research aligned with commercial interests. Deviation was punished through neglect. Over time, the absence of dissent was mistaken for consensus, reinforcing the belief that alternatives had been thoroughly examined and found wanting. The scientists who spoke too loudly did not disappear entirely. Some resurfaced decades later in interviews, expressing frustration not at being wrong, but at never being allowed to be fully heard. Their work remains scattered across obscure publications and personal archives, awaiting reevaluation. Whether their findings would withstand modern scrutiny is an open question. What is clear is that the system never gave them a fair trial. In silencing these voices, medicine lost not only potential treatments, but a vital check on its own assumptions, trading open inquiry for a narrower, more controllable version of truth. By the time the 20th century drew to a close, suppression no longer required active resistance. The groundwork had already been laid in classrooms and textbooks, where the story of medicine was retold in a carefully edited form. What students learned was not simply a record of discoveries, but a narrative shaped by omission. Natural remedies, when mentioned at all, appeared as primitive precursors, stepping stones toward the real breakthroughs of modern pharmacology. Their continued relevance was rarely acknowledged, and their contested disappearance was never discussed. Textbook revisions from the post-war period reveal a steady narrowing of historical perspective. Early editions of medical histories included detailed accounts of plant-based therapies, mineral treatments, and dietary interventions that had shaped clinical practice for centuries. Later editions condensed these sections into brief overviews, emphasizing their role as inspiration rather than viable medicine. The implication was subtle but powerful. These methods belong to the past, useful only insofar as they led to something better. Any suggestion that they might still hold value was excluded as unscientific nostalgia. This reframing had lasting consequences. Students trained within the system internalized a linear model of progress in which medicine evolved inevitably towards synthetic solutions. Deviations from this path were portrayed as errors corrected by science, rather than alternatives sidelined by circumstance. As a result, few questioned why certain treatments vanished, or whether their removal was justified by evidence. The absence of controversy created the illusion of resolution. Editorial correspondence from publishing houses sheds light on how these narratives were shaped. Authors were encouraged to focus on treatments supported by robust modern data, a term often equated with industry-funded research. Historical controversies that reflected poorly on institutional decision-making were labeled tangential and removed for clarity. Over time, the story of suppression became fragmented, reduced to isolated anecdotes with no connective tissue. Without context, they lost their significance. The rewriting extended beyond history into clinical education. Case studies emphasized pharmaceutical interventions as default solutions.
Eat some salad.
Rarely exploring non-drug alternatives unless framed as lifestyle advice. Even when natural compounds formed the basis of widely used drugs, their origins were downplayed. Students learned the names of molecules, not the ecosystems or traditions from which they emerged. This abstraction reinforced the idea that medicine was detached from the natural world, a product of laboratories alone. Once codified in textbooks, these perspectives became self-reinforcing. New generations of doctors taught what they had been taught, perpetuating a cycle in which certain questions were never asked. Research priorities mirrored educational priorities, further marginalizing treatments outside the established canon. The suppression of natural remedies thus became invisible, hidden beneath layers of accepted knowledge. Rewriting history is one of the most enduring forms of control. It does not require force, only repetition. By shaping what is remembered and how it is framed, institutions define the boundaries of thought. In medicine, this process transformed a complex, contested past into a streamlined narrative of progress, leaving little room for doubt or dissent. What was lost was not just information, but the awareness that medicine, like all human endeavors, is shaped by choices, incentives, and power, and that understanding its future requires confronting the parts of its history that were deliberately left out. While institutions debated standards and companies calculated returns, the true impact of suppression unfolded quietly in clinics and homes. Patients rarely appeared in policy documents or corporate memos, yet they bore the consequences of a system that narrowed therapeutic options. The cost was not always immediate or dramatic. It manifested as prolonged illness, unresolved symptoms, and dependence on treatments that managed conditions without addressing underlying causes. These outcomes were difficult to quantify, and so they were rarely measured. Medical records from the latter half of the 20th century show a steady rise in chronic disease management. Conditions once treated with a combination of dietary, environmental, and medicinal approaches were increasingly addressed with long-term pharmaceutical regimens. For many patients, this meant stability. For others, it meant cycles of adjustment as side effects accumulated and efficacy diminished. What is missing from these records is any systematic comparison with the therapies that had been displaced. Without a baseline, the cost of losing alternatives remained invisible. Patient testimonies, preserved in advocacy archives and oral history projects, offer glimpses of what was lost. Individuals describe being discouraged from continuing traditional treatments that had provided partial relief, only to be placed on standardized medications with harsher side effects. Some recount improvements that plateaued once non-drug interventions were abandoned. Others speak of a sense of disempowerment, of becoming passive recipients of care rather than participants in their own treatment. These experiences rarely entered formal evaluation because they did not fit established metrics. The economic burden also shifted. As medicine became more centralized and pharmaceutical dependent, costs rose. Treatments that had once relied on locally sourced remedies were replaced by imported drugs, tying patient access to global supply chains. In times of shortage or price increases, alternatives were no longer available. The resilience of healthcare systems diminished, even as their technological sophistication increased. Yet this vulnerability was framed as an acceptable trade-off for progress. There were populations for whom the cost was especially high. In low-income communities, the loss of affordable, culturally familiar treatments widened disparities. Patients either went without care or relied on black market substitutes of uncertain quality. Ironically, the same authorities that dismissed traditional remedies as unsafe created conditions in which unregulated alternatives flourished. Safety concerns were invoked selectively, protecting certain interests while exposing vulnerable groups to greater risk. Perhaps the most profound cost was psychological. The erosion of trust between patients and the medical system deepened as individuals felt their lived experience was discounted. When treatments failed, the response was often escalation rather than exploration. The possibility that useful knowledge had been discarded was rarely acknowledged. This fostered skepticism and, in some cases, outright rejection of medical authority, a reaction that would later manifest in broader health crises. The cost to patients remains largely unmeasured because it challenges comforting assumptions. It suggests that progress may have been uneven, that gains in some areas were offset by losses in others. Recognizing this does not require rejecting modern medicine, but it does require questioning the completeness of its narrative. The suppression of natural remedies was not an abstract policy decision. It shaped lives in ways that statistics could not easily capture, leaving a legacy of absence that continues to influence how patients experience care today. At the turn of the 21st century, a subtle reversal began to take shape. Advances in information access, combined with growing dissatisfaction among patients with purely symptom-focused care, reopened questions that had long been considered settled. Remedies once dismissed as obsolete resurfaced, not through official endorsement, but through grassroots rediscovery. Researchers revisited old journals. Communities revived practices preserved in family memory. What emerged was not a sudden revelation, but a gradual realization that much had been left unexplored. Unlike earlier eras, this return was driven by data as much as tradition. Improvements in analytical chemistry and systems biology allowed scientists to examine complex natural mixtures with a level of precision previously impossible. Compounds once deemed too variable could now be characterized, their interactions mapped, their mechanisms partially understood. In several cases, these analyses confirmed what practitioners had claimed. Decades earlier, certain natural therapies produced measurable, reproducible effects. Yet their reappearance exposed a familiar tension. Validation did not guarantee acceptance. Pharmaceutical interest quickly followed, but in a recognizable form. Rather than restoring the original remedies, companies focused on isolating components that could be patented. The broader systems from which these compounds originated were again set aside. This approach generated new drugs, some of them effective, but it repeated the cycle of reduction and ownership. The question of whether the intact remedy might offer advantages remained largely unaddressed, not because it lacked merit, but because it resisted incorporation into existing business models. Outside industry, independent research groups and integrative clinics attempted a different path. They combined modern diagnostic tools with treatments drawn from historical sources, documenting outcomes with contemporary methods. Early results were promising, particularly for chronic inflammatory and metabolic conditions. However, scaling these efforts proved difficult. Without large sponsors, studies remained small. Their findings circulated in specialized journals and conferences, influential to some but invisible to most policymakers. Public response to the return of forgotten remedies was mixed. For some patients, rediscovery offered empowerment and hope, a sense of reclaiming agency lost in decades of standardized care. For others, it fueled confusion and mistrust, as conflicting messages about efficacy and safety resurfaced. The medical establishment, wary of repeating past mistakes, emphasized caution. Critics accused it of repeating past suppression. Both perspectives reflected the unresolved legacy of earlier decisions. What distinguishes this period from those that came before is the presence of historical awareness. Unlike the early 20th century, when remedies vanished quietly, their absence is now recognized as part of a broader pattern. Historians, clinicians, and patients increasingly acknowledge that medicine's trajectory was shaped by more than evidence alone. This awareness complicates attempts to simply reintegrate lost treatments. It demands transparency about why they were abandoned and what was lost in the process. The return of forgotten remedies is therefore incomplete and contested. It does not signal a restoration of the past, but a negotiation with it. Each rediscovered therapy carries the weight of history, raising questions about whose knowledge counts and under what conditions it is allowed to persist. Whether this moment leads to meaningful reintegration or another cycle of selective adoption remains uncertain. What is clear is that suppression did not end these remedies. It merely delayed their reconsideration, ensuring that their reemergence would be shaped by the same tensions that once drove them underground. The suppression of natural remedies was never a single event, nor was it the result of one decision or one group acting alone. It was a cumulative process, built from incentives, omissions, and narratives that favored what could be controlled over what could be shared. When viewed in its entirety, the loss becomes clearer. It was not simply a collection of treatments that disappeared, but a way of thinking about medicine that valued diversity, context, and adaptability alongside innovation. What was lost first was curiosity. As institutional pathways narrowed, so too did the questions deemed worth asking. Research agendas converged around profitable targets, leaving vast territories of potential inquiry unexplored. This does not mean that modern medicine failed. It achieved extraordinary advances, saving countless lives. But its success came with a trade-off. In privileging certain forms of evidence and ownership, it limited the scope of what could be discovered. What was also lost was balance. Natural remedies were rarely intended to replace all other forms of treatment. They existed as part of layered systems, offering options when conventional approaches failed or produced intolerable side effects. Their removal created gaps that were filled by escalation rather than substitution. Stronger drugs replaced weaker ones. Chronic conditions became lifelong dependencies. These outcomes were not inevitable, but they became normalized in the absence of alternatives. Looking forward, the challenge is not to romanticize the past or reject the present, but to integrate lessons that were set aside. This requires confronting uncomfortable questions about how evidence is generated, who funds it, and whose interests it serves. It requires acknowledging that absence of proof may reflect absence of inquiry rather than absence of effect. Most importantly, it requires humility, a recognition that no system, however advanced, has a monopoly on truth. There are signs of change. Interdisciplinary research is slowly expanding the boundaries of acceptable study. Patients are increasingly involved in decision-making, demanding transparency and choice. Technology makes it harder to erase knowledge once it exists. Yet these shifts will only matter if institutions are willing to revisit the assumptions that guided earlier suppression. Without that reckoning, the cycle may simply repeat under new names. The story of suppressed natural remedies is ultimately a story about power and memory. It reveals how easily knowledge can be marginalized without being disproven, and how progress can obscure its own costs. Understanding this history does not provide easy answers. It does, however, restore a sense of complexity that has been missing from medical discourse. In that complexity lies the possibility of a more inclusive future, one in which medicine evolves not by erasing alternatives, but by critically examining them, preserving what works, discarding what does not, and remaining open to the idea that the next breakthrough might come not from invention, but from rediscovery